Given that the RX 580 is really just a 480 with an updated VBIOS and newer silicon, we figured it'd be worth attempting to crossfire together an RX 580 and RX 480 to look at performance. This seems like a realistic scenario. RX 480s will get harder to find and prices will soon skyrocket considering the end of life for the RX 480 production, but RX 580s will live on. Owners may resort then to 580s for crossfire. We wanted to make sure it all works as normally, which may or may not include negative scaling. We'll soon find out. Before that, this coverage is brought to you by the Computex Conference, which runs from May 30th to June 3rd in Taipei, Taiwan this year. Computex is the biggest event of the year for PC hardware and technology, where we preview the newest prototypes before they come to market. We highly recommend attending or following this event online. For industry professionals and enthusiasts, learn more at the link in the description below. So the first order of business is to say that yes, this works. You can crossfire a 580 and a 480. It does not take any special hacks. The question here was really just, did AMD impose something that said this won't work? Because in terms of hardware, it's the same architecture. It's still Polaris. The 580 and the 480 are not different other than the voltages and the frequency profiles on the 580 being a bit higher for each. So that means, in theory, which you can do, you would be able to take the 580, put it in the first slot, crossfire it with a 480, and then you're really only going to be bound by the slowest card, which is probably your 480 unless you were to overclock it to match the 580, which is not too hard to do. So that leaves us with the question of scalability and how well does Crossfire do. In our previous coverage of multi-GPU, whether it was Crossfire or SLI, didn't matter which one, I'm struggling to recall if there was ever a scenario where we recommended multi-GPU from either NVIDIA or from AMD. I'm pretty sure we've never recommended that. And it's because the scaling is kind of hit and miss. So when it scales well, it's really cool. It's a great way to get some extra performance out of an older device or an aging device. But when it doesn't scale, you're left with micro stutter and basically forced to disable the multi-GPU technology, whether that's SLI or Crossfire. And that means more effort involved in getting each game to work with the system, configuring profiles to enable or disable Crossfire SLI based on the system and the games. And it's not the most trivial scenario to work with. And you do generally lose some scaling in some of the games that are not really optimized for multi-GPU. So it's always been a question. Now, whether that remains true, we'll see. This is the first Crossfire test of the year for us. So we'll be testing the 580 with the 480. We use Gaming X cards for each. This is a 580 Gaming X. No, this is a 480 Gaming X. This is a 580 Gaming X. As you can see, they are physically identical. And we put those in Crossfire, enabled it in Radeon settings, and we'll give it a go. We've got power testing first, and then game testing. We've got 3D Mark, Firestrike, and TimeSpy linked in the article in the description below if you want to see the synthetics. For the testing, we're really clock limited by the slowest card here, which is going to be the RX 480 Gaming X, but both of them are pretty decent for their categories. The 480 Gaming X was not a bad card when you look at its stock clocks. And then other notes, VRAM doesn't stack, if you're not aware. Most of you probably are, but with things like DX11, there's no VRAM stacking. So we're going to be limited to 8 gigabytes of video memory for anything that uses DirectX 11. Things that use newer APIs might do some extra stuff with the memory. They have the capability to. It's just a matter of whether or not the developers have added that functionality to their particular game. We'll start this test by measuring total system power draw from the wall just to get an idea of how much more consumption is scaling with the multiple cards. With 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme, the Crossfire RX 580 and 480 Gaming X system is drawing 460 watts from the wall. For comparison, the RX 480 Gaming X standalone stock system drew 248 watts, with the 580 stock system at 281. The Crossfire config is drawing about 64% more power than a single 580 Gaming X, or about 85% more power than the single RX 480 Gaming X. With For Honor, our system power draw is at around 426 watts load. That's the highest on the chart so far. The profile with this game has some power management issues, judging by fluctuations on the meter and by some tearing at 1440p and 4K. There's fierce micro stutter at 4K. Regardless, our power draw is about 37% more than the RX 580 Gaming X stock system, which draws 310 watts, and we're about 54% higher in power draw than the RX 480 stock GPU. Idle power draw isn't really affected in a meaningful way here because Crossfire doesn't really do anything when you're on desktop or windowed mode. We've got a couple extra watts for the LEDs and polling, but Crossfire doesn't engage on the desktop, So we're looking at around 80 watts idle wall draw. As stated, you can check the article below for 3D Mark tests. Now let's move on to gaming. We're starting with Mass Effect Andromeda for CrossFire. There's a big challenge with Mass Effect Andromeda, and that seems to be overlooked when considering multi-GPU. Despite folks proclaiming Andromeda's multi-GPU support, there's been limited discussion around the reason why. It's sort of cheating. There's an option that enables by default when going multi-GPU, and it lowers graphics settings to reduce microstutter and improve frame rate. The game doesn't actually tell you which settings it's lowering live while it does it, it just sort of does it. And that means that benchmarking in performance mode for multi-GPU does not produce comparable numbers to the single card benchmarks, since those tests will be more intensive. We've actually got a few screenshots of performance mode versus quality mode that we can show on the screen, and that's for multi-GPU. Quality mode produces the same image quality as a single card, so the graphics actually look the same frame by frame, but there's intense microstutter at high resolutions and just kind of bad frame rates even at 1080p, so it's not a good experience. If you were to enable performance mode, as you can see in the screenshots, the differences between the two show that performance has lower quality primarily in places like ambient occlusion, local reflections, and some changes to depth shading and refractions. You can kind of look at the shiny surfaces and see that the quality of the reflections in those surfaces is reduced, and the ambient occlusion in places like door frames and ceilings is reduced as well with performance mode. So again, the difficulty here is that they are not linear comparisons if you're running performance mode versus a whole bunch of cards that were single GPU running a particular setup. So it's kind of cheating to use performance mode, but we'll put both numbers in the charts anyway just so that everyone can understand the issues and where things fall. 4K doesn't look good for quality mode. We're experiencing intense game-breaking microstutter that doesn't even show up in the already dismal frame rate numbers. We're at 19 FPS average behind both the single RX 480 and single RX 580. This isn't the first time we've seen negative scaling in a game, and it's really pronounced here. You'd be way better off disabling Crossfire in this case, but let's move on to 1440p and show both performance and quality mode numbers. Quality mode produces the same quality frames as every other card and puts us at 38 FPS average, the worst on the chart behind even the RX 470. There is intense negative scaling with Crossfire in this title, at least until we switch on performance mode, which again cheats the graphics to be a bit lower. The game now pegs the 580 and 480 Crossfire configuration at 54 FPS average, tied with an overclocked RX 580 single card configuration. We're ahead of the RX 580 Gaming X single GPU stock by about 1 to 2 FPS. Even with this mode, you're far better off disabling the particular Crossfire configuration we're running and using a single card instead, because 1, your graphics quality will be better, and 2, the frame rate will be mostly equivalent. At best, we're seeing 3% scaling in average FPS. 1080p looks about the same for quality mode, planting the Crossfire config below the RX 470 in average frame rate and far below it in frame time consistency. Scaling is negative here, and it's negative in a big way, 29%. Switching to performance mode puts us at 100 FPS average with 1% lows at 69 and 0.1% at 56. That's finally showing some real scaling over a single 580 Gaming X, which operated a 78.7 FPS average. But again, the single card was under heavier workload, so it's debatable how much you can really count that as a true scaling result if the image quality is not identical between configs. For Honor is another game that has some interesting challenges. Crossfire performed better for us at lower resolutions with this game, like 1440p and 1080p, and did a bit worse in 4K. With 4K, we saw fierce micro-stuttering that would necessitate disabling Crossfire or lowering resolution, as it was utterly unplayable despite not showing up as much in benchmark numbers. We'll skip the 4K results for that reason. Moving instead to a more playable 1440p, we're getting 79 FPS average with 71 and 68 FPS lows on the mixed Crossfire configuration, showing positive scaling over the single RX 580 Gaming X. The performance gain is about 32% with an insignificant amount of tearing as a side effect. Not bad. Scaling over a single RX 480 is about 39%. This puts the configuration between the 980 Ti and the 1070 reference card. At 1080p, scaling is again positive with a 120 FPS average throughput and lows at or above 100 FPS. The RX 580 Gaming X single card performs around 93 FPS average, showing that the mixed Crossfire cards scale over a single 580 Gaming X by about 29%. We're still below a 1070 reference card here. Doom is up next on the list, using Vulkan as the API of choice. Vulkan, just like OpenGL, has never really delivered for multi-GPU users in Doom. We're not seeing any scaling here. At 4K, as we can highlight on the screen, the 580 and Crossfire configuration are basically the same. That carries over to 1440p, where there's slight overhead without any scaling to speak of, at least in a positive way. CrossFire devices, even if you were to use the exact same device, just don't scale in this game. 1080p is no different, as we'll briefly show here. There's slight overhead in the worst case, or just equality in the best case. Ghost Recon Wildlands is a bit worse than lack of scaling. We just couldn't even get the benchmark to start with this one. The game hard crashed at all resolutions with our very high test settings and Ghost Recon Wildlands running. It earns the CrossFire RX 580 and 480 a solid DNF. They did not finish any of the tests with this game. Sniper Elite offers some redemption though. At 4K with DX12 and async compute enabled, we're seeing the CrossFire RX 580 and 480 Gaming X cards place at 79 FPS average with lows at 63 and 60. The RX 580 Gaming X single card operated at about 40 FPS average with lows linearly lower than the CrossFire config. That's scaling of nearly 2x. We almost never see that in games. Sniper Elite is one of the very few titles that can make a case for multi-GPU, but it is surrounded by a games market that is otherwise mixed in multi-GPU readiness. The 79 FPS average of our mixed CrossFire configuration plants the cards ahead of a reference 1080 and about 8% behind the 1080 Ti Gaming X. And that's impressive performance to say the least. It's rare, but impressive in this instance of Sniper Elite 4. Unfortunately, it's not just a low-level API thing. We didn't see any scaling with Vulkan, so that's out. And Ashes of the Singularity posted about a 46.5% scaling, as you can see in this 4K high test chart, so nothing special to speak of there. So the short of this is you could crossfire a 580 with a 480. It's not going to be a problem. You don't even have to flash the BIOS on the 480 to get it up to a 580. It just will work. So that's nice. If you wanted to do it, you could do it. Now, as far as recommending it, this is still not something we recommend. We've never recommended Crossfire. We've never recommended SLI, at least not for gaming. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Sniper Elite is a fantastic fringe case. If you wanted to hold something high and say, look at how great multi-GPU is, you would choose that game to push the narrative because it looks amazing. 100% scaling is unheard of for the most part in our testing at least. So yes, it's happened before. It's happening in Sniper Elite 4. This isn't a common thing, as you can see with the other games here. If you were to play the games on this bench as your kind of monthly suite of games that you play around with, you'd be basically configuring profiles for each one where Ghost Recon, you turn it off. For Honor, you turn it off if you're at 4K, maybe leave it on if you're at 1080 or something like that. Sniper Elite 4, absolutely leave it on. But then you look at some other games, DX11 titles particularly, which there's still a lot of those, scaling is mixed. It's either maybe equal. Sometimes there's negative scaling. The Division showed negative scaling last time we tested Crossfire and SLI. So this is not something we necessarily recommend, is the point. But it works, and when it works well, it's actually really cool. So if you're actually considering this, what you need to look at more is what games am I playing? And then if we haven't tested it, go find a Crossfire benchmark for that game and see if it actually scales. Because if it doesn't and you're only playing a few games, it's a huge waste of money. You'd be better off using a single card, avoiding the headaches, and waiting for either Vega or just getting something like a 1070, although that's kind of a weird upgrade. But you get the idea. Basically, you're better off with a single GPU that's more powerful, as has pretty much always been the case for gaming, at least in the last few years, than going with multi-GPU, even if you already own one of the cards, unless you have a specific game that you play that scales well. Otherwise, look toward Vega or look toward something like a 1080 or something similar to that. That's going to be more powerful than a single one of these cards. So that's all for this one. As always, you can subscribe for more. Go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. Store.gamersnexus.net to grab some of the shirts that we wear on the videos. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.